For 3 years, the neighbors drove past Ruth Caldwell's cornfield and shook their heads at what she'd planted. The stalks were too short, the ears too small, and the kernels came in every color of a creek rock, red and blue and pale glass white. Everyone else in the county planted modern hybrid corn, the kind that grows 8 feet tall and fills a silo by September. Ruth planted what her grandmother had handed down, seeds that had been in the family since before the county had a name, and she never explained why. Then the blight came through in the 3rd summer, and the laughing stopped. Ruth inherited 40 acres and a weathered farmhouse when her grandmother, Vivian Caldwell, died at 92. The property sat at the end of a gravel road outside Cedar Falls, bordered by Tom Aldridge's 300 acres on one side and a county drainage ditch on the other. Vivian had lived there alone for the last 11 years, ever since Ruth's grandfather passed, and she'd kept the place the way she kept everything, carefully and without complaint. Ruth spent the first month after the funeral clearing out the house. She found the things you'd expect to find in a farmhouse that had been occupied for 6 decades. Stacks of old newspapers, mason jars full of buttons, a calendar on the wall from 1998 that Vivian had never bothered to replace. Then she opened the pantry. On the top shelf, behind a row of canned tomatoes, sat a wooden box about the size of a shoebox. The lid was held shut with a rubber band, and across the front, in Vivian's careful handwriting, were 3 words: Web corn, don't mix. Ruth pulled it down and removed the rubber band. Inside, arranged in rows, were a dozen ears of dry corn. The kernels were deep red, dark blue, golden yellow, and a pale color that looked like frosted glass. She'd never seen corn like this outside of a seed catalog, and she'd certainly never seen it in her grandmother's pantry. She sat on the kitchen floor and held one of the ears up to the window light. The kernels caught the sun and threw color back at her, and something stirred in the back of her memory, something she hadn't thought about in years. One evening when she was 14, Vivian had walked her through the small corn patch behind the garden, a patch Ruth had always assumed was decorative because the stalks were short and the ears were small and colorful. Vivian picked an ear, stripped the husk back, and turned it in her hands the way a jeweler turns a stone in good light. "This corn came across the mountains with my great-grandmother," Vivian told her. "Before the county had a name, before the railroad, before any of the seed companies existed." Ruth had asked why she kept it when nobody else did. Vivian looked at the ear for a long time before she answered. "Because this corn carries something the new kinds don't. Save the best ears each year, plant them the next spring, and never mix them with anything else. If you do that, you'll always have something that belongs to this ground." Ruth hadn't understood what her grandmother meant. She was 14, and the advice sounded like one of those things old people say because they like the sound of their own wisdom. She nodded, forgot about it, and went off to college, then to a job in the city, then to a life that had nothing to do with corn or farming or the ground her grandmother had walked for 60 years. But she kept the box. 2 years passed before she decided to plant the seeds. She'd moved back to the farmhouse by then, trading her apartment in the city for 40 acres of inherited ground and a mortgage she didn't need. The county had gone almost entirely to hybrid corn by that point, because the yield was higher and the seed came treated and guaranteed, and even the old-timers who used to save their own seed had switched to the new varieties. Ruth prepared a small section at the south end of her property, maybe 4 acres, and planted the heirloom seed by hand on a Saturday in early May. She knelt in the dirt and pushed each kernel into the soil the way her grandmother had shown her, spacing them by eye instead of by a contractor's chart. It took all day, and when she finished, her knees were sore and her back ached, and the 4 acres looked impossibly small against Tom Aldridge's endless rows of uniform green across the fence line. She didn't know it yet, but she just started something that would take 3 years to prove and 1 summer to justify. Ruth's heirloom corn came up shorter, slower, and thinner than the hybrid fields that surrounded her property on 3 sides. By mid-June, Tom Aldrich's corn was knee-high and deep green, row after row of identical stalks that looked like they'd been stamped out of a machine. Ruth's patch barely reached her shin, and the stalks were different heights, different shades of green, some with a reddish tint at the base that made them look like they belonged to a different century, which in a sense they did. Tom noticed the patch within the first week of June. He slowed his truck along the fence line one morning, leaned out the window and studied Ruth's field for a long time. Then he called across the wire. "What'd you plant out there?" Ruth was hoeing between rows. She straightened up and wiped her face with the back of her glove. "It's family corn." Tom grinned. Not mean, just confused. "So it's family corn. Is that a brand?" "It's what my grandmother grew." Tom looked at the short, uneven stalks and shook his head, still grinning. "County Extension Office gives away better seed for free. You know that, right?" Ruth nodded without looking up. "I know that." He drove off, still shaking his head the way you'd look at someone who insisted on cooking over a wood stove when they had a perfectly good range. By midsummer, the contrast was hard to miss. Tom's corn was head-high, thick-stalked, and so uniform it looked like a wall, and the hybrid fields to the east and west were the same, hundreds of acres of identical plants that moved in the wind like one living thing. Ruth's patch was waist-high at best, with gaps where some stalks hadn't taken, and tassels that didn't match, some purple, some yellow, some almost white. At the feed store in town, on a Thursday morning in late July, Ruth was loading a bag of mineral salt into her truck when Dale Pershing walked up. Dale farmed 200 acres of hybrid corn on the other side of the county and had known Ruth's grandmother for 30 years. "How's that garden project coming along?" he asked, leaning against the tailgate with a grin. Ruth pulled the salt bag into the bed. "It's coming." Dale chuckled. "I drove past last week. Looks like you're growing Indian corn for a fall decoration." A man standing nearby, Hal Whitley, overheard and laughed. "Maybe she's selling it at the farmer's market." Ruth closed the tailgate and didn't say anything. She climbed into the cab and started the engine, and she could hear them still talking as she pulled away, their laughter carrying across the parking lot in the warm July air. October came, and Ruth harvested her first crop. The ears were small, maybe 2/3 the size of a hybrid ear, and the yield was a fraction of what the hybrid fields produced per acre. She figured she got maybe 1/3 of what Tom pulled off the same ground, and that was being generous. But she followed her grandmother's instruction, selecting the best ears, the ones with the fullest kernels and the straightest rows, spreading them on a screen to dry and saving the seed. She ate some of the corn that winter, roasted it and ground it for meal, and noticed the flavor was richer and sweeter than anything she'd bought from a store. The meal made cornbread that tasted the way her grandmother's had tasted, and she sat at the kitchen table eating it and thinking about the wooden box and the woman who'd kept it for 60 years. She didn't try to sell any of it, and she didn't explain her reasons to anyone. She just sorted the seed ears by lamplight that winter, selecting the best kernels for spring, the way Vivian had shown her on an evening she'd half forgotten and now remembered completely. The second spring, Ruth planted again from her saved seed, expanding the patch to 6 acres. The seed she'd selected over the winter came up stronger than the first year, the stalks a little taller, the ears forming a little fuller, and she attributed the improvement to selecting the best ears just as her grandmother had described. The county extension agent arrived in late May. His name was Pete Harkins, a young man from the state university who'd been assigned to 3 counties in the region. He drove a white truck with the university seal on the door and carried a clipboard everywhere he went. And he knocked on Ruth's door on a Tuesday afternoon with the polite, slightly nervous energy of someone who'd been trained to give advice, but hadn't yet learned how to deliver it without sounding like he was lecturing. "Mrs. Caldwell, I noticed your corn patch on my drive-through, and I wanted to stop and offer some recommendations." Ruth poured him coffee and they sat on the porch. Pete explained that the university recommended specific hybrid varieties for this soil zone, varieties that had been tested for yield, disease resistance, and drought tolerance. He had a pamphlet with a chart showing performance data, and he pointed to the top 3 rows. These varieties are bred for this region, and they'll outperform any open-pollinated corn by a wide margin. Ruth looked at the chart. I'm sure they will. Pete hesitated. Is there a particular reason you're growing a decorative variety? It's family corn, Ruth said. It's my grandmother's. Pete nodded slowly. I understand the sentimental value, but from a production standpoint, you're leaving a lot on the table. The yield difference is large, and the hybrid seed is treated for soil pests and early blight. Ruth thanked him for the coffee and the pamphlet and walked him to his truck. At the door, he turned back one more time. If you change your mind, the co-op has a bulk discount this month. She watched his truck disappear down the gravel road, then walked back to the porch and set the pamphlet on the rail. She left it there, and the wind took it eventually. By midsummer, the mockery had found a rhythm. Tom Aldridge drove past every week or so, and always slowed at Ruth's fence. Still growing the hobby corn? He'd call out, grinning. Ruth would nod, and he'd shake his head and drive on. It was the same exchange every time, a small ritual that neither of them took personally, but that neither of them broke either. At the Autumn Harvest Festival, held in the community center behind the Baptist church, Ruth walked in carrying a plate of cornbread made from her own meal. She set it on the potluck table and turned to find 3 farmers standing near the cider press: Dale Pershing, Hal Whitley, and a man named Buck Ledbetter who ran the equipment repair shop in town. Hal saw her first. "Speak of the devil," he said, and the other 2 turned. Dale grinned at her. "Ruth, you bring some of that fancy corn to share?" Buck laughed. "If we all farmed like Ruth, the county would starve." They laughed, all 3 of them, not cruel but comfortable, the way men joke when they're sure they're right. Ruth heard it clearly, and she picked up a cup of cider and walked outside to the porch, where the evening air was cool and the parking lot was full of dusty trucks. She sat on the steps and drank her cider and looked at the hills, and the cornbread stayed on the table inside. Nobody touched it. That winter, Ruth sat at her kitchen table sorting seed ears by lamplight. She selected the best ears, checked each kernel for damage, and lined them up in wooden trays her grandmother had built decades ago. As she worked, she thought about something she'd noticed in September. A late summer windstorm had blown through the county and lodged several of the hybrid fields, bending the tall stalks until they touched the ground. Her corn had bent but hadn't broken, the short, flexible stalks swaying and recovering, while the tall, rigid hybrids snapped under the weight. She filed the observation away without mentioning it to anyone, because it seemed like the kind of thing her grandmother would have noticed and not talked about. The 3rd spring, Ruth planted 8 acres, her largest patch yet. The seed stock had grown each year through careful selection, and she had enough to fill the expanded field without buying a single kernel from anyone. The county was all hybrid by then, and even the last holdouts who'd saved their own seed had switched, drawn by yield numbers and the convenience of buying treated seed that came ready to plant. Ruth was the only person in the county growing open-pollinated corn, and she was fairly sure she was the only one who hadn't bought seed from a company in 3 years. One morning in early May, Tom Aldridge pulled into her driveway with a paper bag on the passenger seat of his truck. He climbed out, walked to the porch, and set the bag on the rail. "Hybrid seed," he said. "From the co-op. Free because I bought bulk and had extra." Ruth looked at the bag. "Tom, I appreciate that." He held up a hand. "It's not charity. It's just common sense. You've got good ground out there, Ruth. Better ground than mine, honestly. And you're wasting it on that family corn." Ruth picked up the bag and turned it over in her hands. Then she set it back on the rail. "Come inside a minute," she said. Tom followed her into the kitchen. She opened the pantry and took down the wooden box, set it on the table, and lifted the lid. The ears inside were the last of her grandmother's original stock, 12 ears of dry corn in colors that didn't look real under the kitchen light. "My grandmother walked those fields for 60 years, Ruth said. She never bought seed from a company, not once." Tom looked at the corn for a long time. He picked up one ear and turned it slowly, the way Ruth had seen him turn a wrench when he was thinking through a repair. The kernels were deep blue and gold, and they threw color in the window light. He put the ear back and closed the lid gently. "I didn't know that." Ruth walked him to the door, and he left the bag of hybrid seed on the porch rail. Ruth watched him drive away, then carried the bag to the barn and left it on a shelf. She never opened it. The growing season started strong. The hybrid fields across the county were the best anyone had seen in years, tall and thick, and a green so deep it looked black from a distance. Tom's 300 acres were a wall of corn that moved in the wind like an ocean, and farmers talked about it at the co-op and the diner and the gas station. This was going to be a record year, and everybody could feel it. Ruth's 8 acres looked the same as they always did, shorter, uneven, colorful, and modest. The stalks were maybe 5 feet tall, and the ears were starting to form in their usual mix of red and blue and yellow and that pale glass white that had caught the light in her grandmother's kitchen. By any commercial measure, the field was unremarkable, and Ruth knew it. By late June, a stretch of humid weather settled over the county. The air stayed thick and warm for 2 weeks straight, the kind of heavy stillness that makes animals restless and old farmers nervous. Ruth walked her field one evening and noticed her corn looked healthy. Nothing unusual, just the steady growth she'd come to expect. But something about the weather felt wrong to her, the kind of wrong her grandmother used to warn about before storms. She drove past Tom's field on the way home and slowed down. In the lower leaves, near the stalk bases, she saw small tan and brown lesions spreading in patterns she didn't recognize. She pulled over and looked more carefully, and the lesions were on every plant she could see from the road. Thousands of them, like someone had flicked a brush of tan paint across the lower canopy. She didn't know what it was. But she remembered something her grandmother had told her once, a story about a blight that came through the county in the 1970s, before Ruth was born. Vivian said it had wiped out fields everywhere because all the corn was the same kind, bred from the same stock, and when the blight found a way in, it found a way into every field at once. Ruth sat in her truck on the shoulder of the road and looked at Tom's field, and the lesions were spreading. She could see them moving up the stalks as she watched, the tan spots darkening at the edges. She drove home and didn't sleep that night. The first week of July, the lesions spread. Tom called the extension office on a Monday morning, and by Monday afternoon, Pete Harkins was in the field with a sample kit and a camera. He took tissue samples from 6 different fields across the county and overnighted them to the State University lab. By Wednesday, the damage was visible from the county road. Fields that had been green and lush in June were turning gray at the edges, then brown, the color creeping inward from the outer rows like a tide coming in. Stalks that had been rigid and tall were softening at the base, bending under their own weight, and the ears that had started to form were shriveling on the stalk. Tom called Ruth that evening. His voice was flat, the way people sound when they're describing something they don't fully understand yet. "Have you seen it?" Ruth had. "I saw the first spots last week." "There's nothing like this in any of the fields around you?" Ruth paused. "Tom, my corn looks fine." There was silence on the line. Then he said, "How fine is it?" "It's green, standing straight, and there are no spots." The silence on the line stretched out, and Ruth could hear Tom breathing. He cleared his throat. "The extension office says it's a fungal blight. They're waiting on the lab to confirm the strain, but they're saying every field they've checked is infected." Ruth looked out her kitchen window toward her 8 acres. In the last light of the evening, the colorful stalks stood against the sky, and beyond her fence line, Tom's 300 acres were turning brown. The lab results came back on Friday. The pathologist at the university confirmed a fungal leaf blight, a strain that thrived in warm, humid conditions and spread rapidly through airborne spores. The report noted that the hybrid varieties planted across the county shared a common genetic background, the same cytoplasm that had been bred into nearly all commercial hybrid corn for uniformity and yield. The blight had found a vulnerability in that shared genetics, and it was exploiting it field by field, the same way a fire spreads through a neighborhood where every house is built from the same wood. Pete Harkins stood at the front of the community center on Saturday evening and faced a room full of farmers still in their work boots. A map of the county was taped to the wall behind him, and every field he'd confirmed as infected was marked with a red dot. The map was nearly covered. A man in the back raised his hand. "Is there any corn in the county that isn't affected?" Pete hesitated and looked at his notes. "There's one field that looked clean on my last drive-through. I need to confirm it before I say anything else." He didn't name the field, and he didn't have to. By the next morning, half the county had driven past Ruth Caldwell's property, and they could see it for themselves. Pete drove out to Ruth's place on Sunday morning with a plant pathologist from the university, a quiet woman named Dr. Ann Marsh, who carried a field kit and spoke in short, precise sentences. They walked the rows together, Pete pointing and Dr. Marsh examining, and she knelt at the base of the stalks and checked the lower leaves where the blight always appeared first on the hybrids. She found nothing, no lesions, no discoloration, no fungal growth, and she moved to the next row with the same result. She checked 20 plants across 4 rows, taking tissue samples from each one. She stood up, brushed the dirt from her knees, and looked at Pete. "This corn is clean." Pete nodded at her words. "I already knew." Dr. Marsh looked across the field, then back toward the county road, where the nearest hybrid field was visible, a brown, collapsing ruin under the same sky and the same soil. "What variety is this?" Ruth, who'd been standing by the fence, walked over to them. "It's a family variety, my grandmother's corn. It's been in our family for over 100 years. Dr. Marsh turned to her. "Open-pollinated?" Ruth gave a small nod. "My grandmother saved the seed every year and never mixed it." Dr. Marsh was quiet for a moment, then pulled a notebook from her field kit and wrote something down. "This corn carries a genetic background that predates the hybrid era by generations. Whatever resistance it has to this blight isn't engineered or bred in. It's been carried forward through seed saving, and it's part of the variety's natural genetics." She looked at Ruth. "You're the only person in this county growing open-pollinated corn?" "I believe so." Dr. Marsh nodded slowly. "That might be why you're the only one with a standing crop." Pete drove back to the extension office and made 3 phone calls. The first was to the State Agricultural Board, the second was to the county commissioner, and the third was to Ruth, asking if she'd be willing to sell seed for the following spring. By the end of that week, the county's corn crop was officially declared a total loss. Every hybrid field, every treated seed, every genetically uniform row, all of it was gone. Ruth Caldwell's 8 acres were the only green in a brown valley. Word traveled fast in a small county. Within 2 days of the community center meeting, farmers who'd lost everything were driving past Ruth's property and slowing to a stop along the fence line. Some got out and walked the wire, looking at the corn the way you look at something you've seen 100 times but never actually looked at. The stalks were short and uneven and colorful, and they were alive. Tom Aldridge came by first. He parked his truck at the end of the lane and walked the fence line for a long time without saying anything, while Ruth sat on the porch shelling beans and watched him. He stopped at the corner of the field where his property line met hers, the same corner where he'd slowed his truck 3 years ago to ask what she'd planted, and he stood there looking at the corn with his hands in his pockets. He walked back to the porch, and his face was weathered and tired, the face of a man who'd just watched his entire crop collapse in 2 weeks. "Your grandmother's corn," he said. Ruth nodded slowly. Tom took off his hat and wiped his face with the back of his hand. He didn't say anything else for a while, and the silence between them was the kind that carries more weight than words. Then he put his hat back on and walked to his truck and drove away. Dale Pershing showed up the next morning with a flatbed trailer hitched to his truck. He parked in the drive and walked up to the porch with his hands in his pockets, and he didn't grin this time. "I need feed corn," he said. "My cattle have got nothing. The silage is all spoiled, and I heard you might have some to sell." Ruth looked at him. 3 years ago, he'd stood at the harvest festival and laughed with the others. Now he was standing on her porch, asking to buy what he'd joked about, and the distance between those two moments was something neither of them needed to say out loud. She loaded the trailer with what she could spare and charged a fair price, not a penny more than she would have charged anyone else, because that's what her grandmother would have done. Dale shook her hand at the tailgate and drove away with a full load. The county extension office called that afternoon. Pete Harkins asked if Ruth could sell seed for next spring, because the seed companies wouldn't have enough resistant stock for the whole county by planting season. The earliest they could deliver was the following year, maybe later, depending on how fast they could breed resistance into their existing lines. Ruth looked at her seed room, where 3 years of carefully saved ears were stacked in wooden trays labeled by year, and she had enough to start. She told Pete she'd sell seed with one condition. Anyone who bought from her had to save their own ears at harvest and bring some back the following year so the stock would grow and stay in the county. She wasn't going to be the only source forever. She was going to be the source that taught other people to be sources. Pete agreed to the terms. Hal Whitley came by that weekend. He parked at the end of the lane and sat in his truck for a few minutes before getting out, and Ruth watched him from the porch as he walked up the steps slowly, carrying his hat in both hands. He bought 2 sacks of seed corn and carried them to his truck without saying much. At the tailgate, he stopped and turned back. "I said something at the festival a couple years back." He looked at the ground. "About the county starving. I shouldn't have said that." Ruth looked at him from the porch. "I know that, but you're here now." Hal nodded once, climbed into his truck, and drove away. The heirloom corn went into fields across the county that spring. 30 acres, then 40, then 50, spread among the farmers who'd lost their hybrid crops and bought her seed. The corn came up short and colorful and uneven, just like Ruth's, and nobody laughed. Ruth drove the county roads in her grandfather's old truck, stopping at fields to check the stand and answering questions about spacing and soil and when to harvest for seed. She showed farmers how to select the best ears, how to dry them, and how to store them through the winter so the kernels stayed viable. She taught them what her grandmother had taught her, the thing she'd half understood at 14 and fully understood now, that the value of a seed isn't in how much it produces, but in how long it keeps producing when everything else fails. The wooden box that Vivian had labeled sat on Ruth's kitchen table, empty, because the seeds that had been inside it were growing in the ground across the valley. They were in fields that had once been solid walls of identical hybrid corn and were now patchworks of color, red and blue and yellow, and that pale glass white that caught the light like something stored in a jar. Pete Harkins told her the university wanted to study the variety, to understand the resistance, and potentially breed it into their own lines. Ruth said they could look, but the seed stayed with the farmers. She'd seen what happened when one company owned the genetics, and she wasn't going to let that happen to her grandmother's corn. One evening that fall, Tom Aldridge pulled up to Ruth's fence. Her field was full of corn in every color, and it was all standing straight and green and alive, the ears heavy and the tassels waving in the breeze. Beyond her fence, the county's fields were the same, a patchwork of colors that looked like a quilt laid across the valley floor. Tom looked at it for a while, the light going gold and long across the hills. Then he said, "Your grandmother knew something the rest of us forgot." Ruth leaned on the fence beside him and watched the light move across the corn. She didn't know it. She just never threw it away. Ruth's grandmother kept a box of seeds because she trusted what she had more than what she was sold. The county learned that lesson the hard way. If you want to hear the next story from these back roads, subscribe. There's always another field nobody wanted.